The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone understood what was happening. Maya Bennett stood frozen, a small white plate trembling in her hand, as laughter rippled across the ballroom like a wave nobody could stop. She had come to this party to support her sister. She had not come to be humiliated. But that was exactly what was happening, and it was happening in front of nearly 200 guests dressed in silk and diamonds. "You're too fat for him," Isabella Rossi said again, louder this time, her voice slicing through the music like a blade through silk. "Did you really think Dante would keep you around forever? Sweetheart, men like him don't marry women like you. They keep you as a secret." The room seemed to hold its breath. Maya felt her cheeks burn, felt the weight of every eye turning toward her, felt her heart pounding so hard she thought people might hear it over the string quartet. She had known Isabella disliked her. She had not known Isabella would do this here now, in front of everyone who mattered in Dante Morti's world. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. What was there to say? She had spent months quietly wondering the same thing Isabella had just said out loud. She had watched Dante move through rooms like this one with effortless command, greeting senators and businessmen with a handshake that made grown men nervous, while she stood beside him in a dress she had bought on sale, feeling like an imposter in a world built of marble and secrets. "Isabella," Maya finally managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Isabella laughed, tossing her dark hair over one shoulder. "Nothing about this is fair, darling. It's not fair that you walked into his life and confused him. It's not fair that he wastes his time with someone who doesn't belong in this room, but someone had to say it." A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply watched, the way people watch a car accident they cannot look away from. Maya's sister, Grace, pushed through the crowd, her face pale with fury, but before she could reach Maya's side, a voice cut through the room that made every single person go silent. "Say that again." The voice was calm, that was the strange part. It was not shouting. It was not shaking with rage the way Maya expected a man's voice to shake in a moment like this. It was quiet, steady, and somehow far more frightening than any shout could have been. Dante Morti stood at the edge of the crowd, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable except for the tightness around his jaw. He had not been at the dessert table a moment ago. Maya had not seen him arrive. But now he was there, and the entire room seemed to shrink around him, the way it always did when he entered a space. Isabella's confidence flickered, just for a second before she rebuilt it. "Dante, I was only saying what everyone already thinks." "Were you?" His voice remained level, but there was something underneath it now, something cold and sharp like ice forming over dark water. "Say it again. I want to make sure I heard you correctly." The silence stretched long enough that Maya could hear her own pulse in her ears. Isabella's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but no one met her gaze. The guests who had been laughing moments ago now looked like they wished they were somewhere else entirely. "I said," Isabella began, her voice losing some of its earlier bite, "that Maya isn't exactly the kind of woman people expect to see on your arm." Dante walked forward, slow and deliberate, each step measured, until he stood directly between Isabella and Maya. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Let me explain something to you," he said, "since you seem to have forgotten who you're speaking to and, more importantly, who you're speaking about." He turned just slightly so that his shoulder faced Isabella and his eyes found Maya instead. Something in his expression softened instantly, the ice melting into warmth so sudden it took Maya's breath away. "Maya," he said gently, "come here." Maya hesitated. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear into the crowd and never come back. But something in the way he looked at her, something steady and certain, made her feet move forward instead. She crossed the small distance between them, and Dante reached for her hand, lifting it gently, pressing his lips against her knuckles in front of everyone watching. This woman, he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom, runs a bakery 3 blocks from my father's old restaurant. She wakes up at 4 in the morning to knead dough with her own hands. She remembers the names of every regular customer who walks through her door, and she gives free bread to anyone who can't afford it that week, even though she'd never tell you that herself. Maya felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. She had not known he knew all of that. She had never told him the last part. She has never once asked me for anything, Dante continued, his gaze steady on the crowd now. Not money, not power, not a single favor from this family. She has never flinched at anything she's learned about who I am or what my name means in this city. And in a world where everyone around me wants something, she is the only person who has ever simply wanted me. He turned back to Isabella, and the warmth in his voice vanished as quickly as it had appeared. You, on the other hand, he said, spent 2 years wanting my last name, my bank accounts, and my father's approval. You never once wanted me. So do not stand in this room and pretend you understand the first thing about what real value looks like. Isabella's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The guests around her began to shift uncomfortably, some turning away entirely, unwilling to be associated with her humiliation. I think it's time you left, Dante said quietly. For a moment, Isabella looked like she might argue. Her eyes flicked toward the older men standing near the bar, men Maya recognized as important figures in Dante's world, men whose opinions clearly still mattered to her. But none of them met her gaze. None of them offered her an escape. This isn't over, Isabella finally hissed, low enough that only Maya and Dante could hear it. Then she turned on her heel and walked out, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that sounded almost like retreat. The moment she disappeared through the ballroom doors, the tension in the room broke like a held breath finally released. The music resumed, hesitant at first, then more confident. Conversations slowly rebuilt themselves around the edges of what had just happened, but Maya barely noticed any of it. She was still staring at Dante, stunned by what had just occurred. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, he said, I did. He guided her gently toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from curious eyes, near a tall window that overlooked the city lights stretching endlessly into the night. Maya could feel her hands still trembling, the adrenaline of the moment refusing to fade. Maya, look at me, Dante said softly. She lifted her eyes to his, and what she saw there startled her. There was no anger left in his expression, only something far more tender, something that made her chest ache in a different way entirely. I have spent my entire life around people who measure worth in numbers, he said. Money, power, connections, appearances. I grew up being taught that everything and everyone has a price, that loyalty is bought, that love is a transaction. And I believed it for a long time because it was the only truth I was ever shown. He paused, glancing briefly toward the window, toward the city that had shaped him into the man he had become, before turning his attention back to her. Then I met you, he continued. A woman who has never once tried to impress me, who argues with me about the right way to fold dough like it's the most important debate in the world, who laughs so loudly at her own jokes that people 2 tables away turn to look. You have never asked me what I'm worth. You've only ever asked me how my day was. Maya felt tears slipping down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. I didn't think you noticed things like that. I notice everything about you, he said. That's the problem. Isabella spent 2 years trying to become someone important in my world, and I barely remember a single conversation we had. You've been in my life for 8 months, and I remember every single thing you've ever told me. She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. This is not how I imagined tonight going. No, he agreed, a small smile finally breaking through his composed expression. I imagined it going considerably better, honestly. You call this better? I call it honest, he said. Sometimes the truth needs an audience to matter. They stood together by the window for a long moment, the city lights flickering below them like scattered stars fallen to earth. Maya's heartbeat slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the humiliation of the evening still sat heavy in her chest, a wound that would take longer than one gentle speech to heal completely. She's not going to let this go, Maya said quietly. You saw her face when she left. Dante's expression grew serious again. I know. What does that mean? He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It means Isabella doesn't handle rejection well. It never has, not with me, not with anyone. And in my world, people who don't handle things well sometimes make choices that hurt more than just their own pride. A chill ran down Maya's spine that had nothing to do with the open window beside them. Should I be worried? You should be careful, he said. There's a difference, I will make sure of that. Across the ballroom, Grace finally managed to push her way through the crowd, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering fury. She wrapped her arms around Maya without hesitation, ignoring the expensive dress she might be wrinkling. I wanted to throw a drink at her, Grace muttered against Maya's shoulder. I really did. I had it in my hand and everything. Maya laughed despite herself, the sound cracking slightly with leftover emotion. I'm glad you didn't. That would have made the papers tomorrow for entirely different reasons. Small mercies, Grace said, pulling back to study her sister's face. Are you okay? Really okay? Maya glanced toward Dante, who was watching the exchange with quiet patience, giving the sisters space to have their moment. I think I will be, she said. Eventually. The rest of the evening passed in a strange blur. People who had watched the confrontation now approached Maya with unexpected warmth, some offering quiet words of support, others simply nodding respectfully in her direction, as if something about her had shifted in their eyes. She realized slowly that Dante's public defense had changed something fundamental about how this world perceived her. She was no longer simply the woman on his arm. She was someone worth defending, worth respecting, worth noticing. But even as the night wore on and the tension gradually eased, Maya couldn't shake the memory of Isabella's parting words. This isn't over. She had said it quietly, almost like a promise rather than a threat, and something about the certainty in her voice lingered in Maya's mind long after the party ended. Later that night, as Dante drove her home through quiet streets lit by amber streetlights, Maya finally voiced the question that had been sitting heavy in her chest since the moment Isabella walked away. What did you mean earlier, she asked, about people in your world not handling rejection well? Dante kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but Maya noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. Isabella comes from a family that values pride above almost everything else. Public humiliation, the kind she experienced tonight, isn't something people like her simply absorb and move on from. It festers. Festers into what exactly? He glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. I don't know yet. And I would rather not guess out loud and frighten you over nothing. That's not very reassuring. No, he admitted, it isn't, but I promise you this much, Maya. Whatever happens next, you will not face it alone, not for a single moment. She studied his profile in the passing glow of streetlights, the sharp lines of his face softened slightly by shadow, and felt something settle inside her chest despite the uncertainty of his words. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, or what Isabella's parting threat truly meant. But she believed him when he said she would not face it alone, and for tonight, that belief was enough to carry her home. The car pulled up outside her small apartment building, the same modest brick structure she had lived in for the past 6 years, and Dante walked her to the door the way he always did, unwilling to simply drop her off and drive away. At her doorstep, he paused, studying her face carefully. Thank you, Maya said softly, for tonight, for everything you said. I meant every word, he replied. I need you to know that. This isn't about proving a point to a room full of people I barely respect. This is about you understanding exactly how I see you every single day, whether we're standing in a ballroom or sitting in your kitchen eating burnt toast." Maya laughed, the sound warmer now, some of the evening's heaviness finally beginning to lift. "That toast was one time. It was memorable," he said, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her gently, softly, the kind of kiss that asked for nothing and simply gave everything. And for a moment, the ballroom, the whispers, and Isabella's cruel words all faded into something distant and unimportant. There was only this quiet doorstep, this quiet man, and the strange, unexpected certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. But as Dante drove away into the night, Maya stood on her doorstep a moment longer, watching his taillights disappear around the corner, and she could not quite shake the feeling that Isabella's threat had not been an empty one. Somewhere in the city, behind expensive curtains and locked doors, a woman scorned was already beginning to plan her next move, and Maya had no idea just how far that plan would eventually reach. She went inside, locked her door out of habit rather than fear, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, replaying the evening in her mind. The humiliation, the silence, the sudden warmth of Dante's defense, the way the entire room had shifted around her in an instant. It had been the most frightening and most extraordinary night of her life, and somewhere beneath the exhaustion, she felt something new stirring inside her chest. For the first time since she had started dating Dante Morty, Maya understood fully and completely what it meant to be truly chosen, not tolerated, not merely accepted despite her differences. Chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, in front of everyone who had ever doubted she belonged. She did not yet know that this choosing would soon be tested in ways far more dangerous than cruel words at a party. She did not know that Isabella's wounded pride would soon collide with older, darker grievances simmering beneath the surface of Dante's world, grievances that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. She only knew, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, that whatever came next, she would not face it as the same woman who had walked into that ballroom hours earlier, uncertain of her place. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who had been chosen in front of the entire world, and who was slowly beginning to believe, for the first time in a long while, that she deserved exactly that. Sunday morning arrived with soft gray light filtering through Maya's kitchen window, and she woke earlier than usual, her mind still replaying fragments of the previous night. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to separate what she truly felt from what exhaustion and shock had layered over everything. The humiliation was still there, tucked somewhere beneath her ribs, but so was something new, something steadier, something that felt almost like pride. She made her way to the bakery earlier than she needed to, unlocking the front door before the sun had fully risen, finding comfort in the familiar ritual of flipping on the ovens and measuring flour into the large steel bowl she had used every morning for the past 6 years. The rhythm of kneading dough had always been her way of thinking clearly, her hands working while her mind sorted through whatever weighed on her. By the time her first customers arrived, the shop smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, and Maya found herself smiling more easily than she expected, greeting regulars by name, remembering that Mr. Alvarez preferred his coffee black, and that the young mother who came in every Tuesday always needed 2 extra napkins for her toddler. This was her world, small and honest, and no amount of whispered cruelty in a marble ballroom could take that away from her. Grace stopped by around noon, sliding onto a stool at the counter with the particular expression she wore when she had something important to say. "I've been thinking about last night," Grace said, watching her sister wipe down the counter. "About what Isabella said and about what Dante said back. And I think you should know that everyone in that room believed him," Grace said. "Not because he's powerful, but because anyone with eyes could see he meant every word. I haven't seen a man look at a woman like that in a long time." Maya paused, the cloth still in her hand. It still hurt what she said. "Of course it did," Grace said gently. "Cruelty aimed well enough always finds a tender spot, no matter how confident you normally feel. But Maya, you didn't shrink. You stood there and let her words land, and then you let Dante's words land too, and you're still standing here this morning making bread for strangers who adore you. That's not weakness. That's strength most people never have to test." Maya felt her eyes sting again, though this time the tears carried something warmer than humiliation. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been the smart sister," Grace said with a playful smile, earning a genuine laugh from Maya for the first time since the party. The two sisters spent the rest of the afternoon working side by side, Grace helping restock the display case, while customers drifted in and out with their usual quiet rhythm. It was, in many ways, an entirely ordinary day, and Maya found herself grateful for the ordinariness of it, for the chance to simply exist in her own life without the weight of expensive chandeliers and watchful eyes. Dante called that evening, his voice warm through the phone. "How was your day?" "Normal," Maya said, smiling despite herself. "Wonderfully, completely normal." "I'm glad," he said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. "I was worried you'd wake up regretting everything, regretting me." "Never," Maya said firmly. "Dante, last night was hard, but it also showed me something I needed to see. You didn't just defend me. You saw me completely, in a way I didn't think anyone in your world was capable of seeing." "I've always seen you," he said quietly. "I just hadn't said it loudly enough until last night." They talked for nearly an hour, the conversation drifting easily between small, comfortable topics: the bakery, his day, a movie they had been meaning to watch together, until the tension of the previous evening felt like a distant memory rather than a fresh wound. But even as Maya settled into bed that night, feeling lighter than she had in days, some small, cautious part of her mind returned again and again to Isabella's final words, spoken so quietly yet so certainly. "This isn't over." She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was simply wounded pride talking, the kind of empty threat people made when they had lost and needed to feel powerful one last time. She had no way of knowing, as she finally drifted into sleep, how wrong that comforting assumption would soon prove to be. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware of the storm quietly gathering in its shadows. 3 days after the party, Maya found a folded note tucked under the front door of her bakery, and the moment she read it, her hands began to shake. "Stay away from him, or you will regret it." There was no signature, no explanation, just 7 words written in sharp, angry handwriting that pressed so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through in places. Maya stood behind the counter for a long moment, staring at the note, her morning routine of flour and sugar suddenly feeling very far away. She thought about calling Dante immediately. Her fingers even hovered over his name in her phone. But something held her back, a stubborn voice in her head insisting that this was probably nothing, probably some jealous customer or a prank from a bored teenager, nothing worth worrying a man like Dante over. She folded the note and tucked it into her apron pocket instead, promising herself she would mention it later, once she had calmed down enough to speak about it without sounding foolish. That promise did not last long. 2 days later, a second note appeared, this time slipped through the mail slot of her apartment, far from the public eye of the bakery. This one was worse. "He deserves better than a woman who will never fit into his world. Walk away before someone makes you regret staying." Maya sat on her kitchen floor that evening, her back pressed against the cabinets, staring at the note until the words blurred together. This was not a prank. Pranks did not follow you home. Pranks did not know where you lived. She finally called Dante, her voice trembling as she read the messages aloud over the phone. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, long enough that Maya wondered if the call had dropped. "Dante." "I'm here," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I'm coming over right now. Do not open your door for anyone else tonight." He arrived within 20 minutes, his usual composed expression replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. He read both notes carefully, turning them over in his hands as if searching for some hidden clue in the paper itself, before setting them down on Maya's small kitchen table with deliberate care. "This is her," he said quietly. "This is Isabella's handwriting. I would know it anywhere." "Are you certain?" "I spent 2 years reading her handwritten notes left on my desk every morning," he said grimly. "Yes, I'm certain." Maya wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warmth of her apartment. "What do we do?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes distant as he considered his next words carefully. "I need to speak with her directly, and I need you to stay somewhere safer for a few days, somewhere she doesn't know to look." "Dante, I have a bakery to run. I can't just disappear." "I'm not asking you to disappear," he said. "I'm asking you to let me put a few precautions in place. Please, Maya, this is not something I'm willing to gamble with." Reluctantly, she agreed, and within a day, 2 quiet, unassuming men began appearing near her bakery at odd hours, never speaking to her directly, simply present, watchful, a silent reassurance she hadn't asked for but found herself grateful to have. Dante did not explain who they were beyond calling them people he trusted, and Maya did not push for more detail than that. She was beginning to understand that there were parts of his world she would need to accept without fully understanding, at least for now. A week passed with no further notes, and Maya slowly allowed herself to relax, though the uneasy feeling never fully left her chest. She threw herself into work instead, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of her bakery, the smell of fresh bread rising each morning, the easy chatter of regular customers who had no idea what storm might be gathering just beyond her door. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the bakery nearly empty, when Maya first noticed the woman sitting alone at the corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold. She wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky outside, and something about her posture, tense and watchful, made Maya's stomach twist with unease. "Can I get you anything else?" Maya asked, approaching the table with practiced politeness despite the uneasy feeling crawling up her spine. The woman removed her sunglasses slowly, revealing sharp, calculating eyes that Maya recognized instantly. "Isabella." "We should talk," Isabella said, her voice quieter than it had been at the party, though no less cold. Maya's first instinct was to call for help, to signal one of the watchful men Dante had stationed nearby. But something in Isabella's expression, some flicker of desperation beneath the composed exterior, made her hesitate. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," Maya said carefully, keeping her distance. "You're wrong," Isabella said. "You have no idea what you've walked into. Dante didn't just inherit a family business, Maya. He inherited enemies, old ones, dangerous ones. And now that you're standing beside him in public, you've made yourself a target too." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Isabella snapped, though something in her voice cracked slightly, betraying an emotion beneath the anger that Maya couldn't quite identify. "I didn't send those notes to scare you for fun. I sent them because I know things you don't." Maya's pulse quickened. "What things?" Isabella glanced around the empty bakery, lowering her voice further. "There's a family, the Callaways, that has hated the Mortys for over a decade. They lost significant territory when Dante's father expanded years ago, and they've been waiting for any weakness to exploit ever since. A public relationship, a woman outside the usual circles, someone without protection or history in this world. That's exactly the kind of weakness they've been looking for." "Why would you tell me this?" Maya asked, suspicion coloring her voice. "You hate me. You humiliated me in front of 200 people." Isabella's expression flickered, something almost like regret passing across her features before hardening again. "Because despite everything, I don't actually want you dead, Maya." I wanted you gone, embarrassed enough to leave on your own. I didn't think it would go this far." "How far has it gone?" Isabella hesitated, glancing toward the window as if checking for someone watching from outside. "I made a mistake. A few months ago, frustrated and angry after Dante ended things with me, I mentioned some details about his personal life to someone I shouldn't have trusted. Small things, where he liked to eat, who he was seeing. I didn't think it mattered at the time." Maya felt the blood drain from her face. "Who did you tell?" "Nathan Calloway," Isabella whispered. "I didn't know then what he intended to do with the information. I swear I didn't. But now I think he's using you, as leverage against Dante. And I don't know how to stop what I started." The bakery door chimed, and both women turned sharply, tension coiling through the room. But it was only an elderly, regular customer shuffling in for his usual afternoon coffee, entirely unaware of the conversation he had just interrupted. Isabella quickly replaced her sunglasses, standing abruptly from the table. "Be careful," she said quietly. "Watch who's around you. Watch everything." Then she slipped out the door before Maya could ask another question, disappearing into the gray afternoon as quickly as she had appeared. Maya stood frozen behind the counter for a long moment, her mind racing through everything she had just heard. She barely registered serving the elderly customer his coffee, her hands moving on autopilot while her thoughts spun in frightened circles. The moment the shop was empty again, she called Dante, her voice trembling as she recounted the entire conversation. He arrived at the bakery within 15 minutes, his expression grave as he listened to every detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the street beyond, his jaw tight with restrained anger. "Nathan Calloway," he said finally, almost to himself. "It makes sense now. There have been small signs for weeks, deliveries rerouted without explanation, a supplier suddenly refusing to work with my family after 15 years of partnership. I thought it was simply business friction. I didn't realize it was connected to something larger." "Isabella said he's using me as leverage," Maya said quietly. "What does that mean exactly?" Dante turned to face her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw genuine fear flicker across his expression, quickly masked but unmistakable. "It means he believes hurting you would hurt me more deeply than any attack on my business or my family directly. And he may be right." "Dante, I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, crossing the small distance between them and taking her hands firmly in his. "From this moment forward, things are going to change. More security, less freedom to move around the city without protection. I know that's not the life you signed up for, and I am so sorry to be asking this of you. But I cannot lose you over my family's old conflicts." Maya nodded slowly, fear and determination mixing together in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere, Dante. I'm scared, yes, but I'm not running." Something in his expression softened, relief and love mixing together as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "I don't deserve you," he murmured into her hair. "You deserve exactly this," she replied, "someone who stays." Over the following days, Maya's life shifted into something unrecognizable from the quiet routine she had built for herself over the years. Security cameras appeared around her bakery and apartment, installed quietly and efficiently by men who never explained themselves beyond polite nods. A car followed her at a discreet distance whenever she left either location, always present but never intrusive enough to draw unwanted attention. Dante called her multiple times a day, his voice tight with worry each time, checking on her safety with a persistence that would have felt suffocating from anyone else, but from him felt like devotion. Grace, sensing something was deeply wrong despite Maya's attempts to downplay the situation, eventually cornered her sister in the small apartment kitchen one evening, refusing to leave until Maya explained everything. "You're scaring me," Grace said after hearing the full story, her face pale with worry. This is not the life I imagined for you when you started dating him." "I know," Maya admitted. "It's not the life I imagined either. But I love him, Grace. And loving someone means accepting the complicated parts along with the good ones. Even parts that might get you killed." The blunt question hung heavy in the air between them, and Maya found she had no easy answer to offer. She simply reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. "Dante would never let that happen. I believe that completely." Grace studied her sister's face for a long moment before finally sighing, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Fine, but I'm staying here tonight, and probably several more nights after that, until this situation with the Callaways resolves itself." Maya smiled despite the fear still coiled tight in her chest. "I would like that." That night, as the two sisters settled into an uneasy sleep in Maya's small apartment, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked quietly across the street, its occupant watching the building with patient, calculating eyes. Nathan Calloway had been observing Maya's movements for nearly 2 weeks now, gathering information, waiting for the perfect moment to make his next move. Isabella's warning had come too late to stop what was already set in motion, and somewhere in the city, plans were already shifting from observation into something far more dangerous. Dante, sitting awake in his own home across town, stared at a series of photographs spread across his desk, images gathered by his own men over the past several days showing Nathan Calloway's associates near Maya's neighborhood at unusual hours. His hands clenched into fists as he studied each photograph carefully, memorizing faces, calculating threats, preparing for a confrontation he now understood was inevitable. He thought of Maya sleeping peacefully just a few miles away, unaware of exactly how close danger had crept toward her door, and something cold and determined settled into his chest. Whatever needed to happen next, whatever measures needed to be taken, he would not allow Nathan Calloway to touch a single hair on her head. The old conflicts between his family and the Calloways had simmered quietly for years, an uneasy truce maintained through mutual exhaustion rather than genuine peace. But that truce, Dante realized as he stared at the photographs before him, was about to shatter completely, and Maya, innocent and unaware just weeks ago, now stood directly in the center of a storm that had been building for far longer than she could have imagined. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used, one belonging to Lucas Hale, a man who had grown up alongside him, closer than a brother, someone Dante trusted with the kind of decisions that could not be made carelessly. "It's late," Lucas said by way of greeting, though there was no real complaint in his voice. "Nathan Calloway is watching Maya," Dante said without preamble. "I need eyes on her at all times, and I need to know everything about his current operations before this escalates any further." "I'll have someone at her building within the hour," Lucas said, his tone shifting instantly into focused seriousness. "And I'll start pulling together what we know about Calloway's recent movements. Dante, if he's already this bold, he's likely testing how far he can push before you respond." "I'm aware," Dante said grimly, "which is exactly why I need to respond carefully, not recklessly. My father built decades of relative peace with the Calloways through patience. I'm not going to unravel that with a single impulsive mistake." "Understood," Lucas said. "I'll call you the moment I have anything." Dante hung up the phone and sat alone in his study for a long while, the photographs still spread before him, his mind turning over every possible outcome of the coming days. He thought of Maya asleep in her apartment, unaware of exactly how carefully she was now being watched, both by the men protecting her and by the men who wished her harm, and something fierce and protective settled deep in his chest, a feeling entirely unfamiliar in its intensity. He had grown up believing that love, real love, was a liability in his world, a weakness that made a person predictable and therefore exploitable. His father had warned him of this many times over the years, citing examples of men who had lost everything, because an enemy correctly identified who they loved most and used that knowledge as a weapon. Dante had accepted this lesson as simple fact for most of his life, keeping relationships carefully guarded, never allowing anyone close enough to become a genuine vulnerability. Maya had changed that without either of them fully realizing it was happening. She had slipped past every careful guard he had built over years of disciplined caution, not through any calculated effort on her part, but simply by being exactly who she was, warm and honest and entirely unconcerned with the power structures that governed his everyday life. And now, precisely because of that closeness, she had become the very vulnerability his father had always warned him about. The realization did not make him regret loving her. If anything, it strengthened his resolve to protect her, to prove that his father's old lesson, while perhaps true in a general sense, did not have to define the entirety of his own life. He would find a way to keep both his heart and his family safe. He simply had not yet determined exactly how. Outside his window, the city lights stretched endlessly into darkness, hiding within their glow both old enemies and new dangers, waiting patiently for the moment everything would finally come to a head. The following weeks passed in a strange rhythm of forced normalcy layered over constant, quiet fear. Maya continued opening her bakery each morning at 5, kneading dough with hands that had grown steadier over time despite everything happening around her, though she never fully lost the habit of glancing toward the windows more often than she used to, checking the faces of customers a little longer before offering her usual warm smile. Grace had moved into the apartment permanently for the time being, and the two sisters had settled into an unspoken routine of quiet vigilance, neither one mentioning the fear that lived constantly beneath their daily conversations. Dante visited every evening without fail, sometimes staying only long enough to share a quiet dinner before disappearing again into meetings Maya knew better than to ask too many questions about. She had learned, over these tense weeks, to read the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders carried more weight with each passing day, though he never once complained or suggested that any of this was her fault. "You look tired," she said one evening, studying his face across her small kitchen table as he pushed food around his plate without much appetite. "I am tired," he admitted, setting down his fork. "Negotiating an old grudge without triggering an actual war is more exhausting than I anticipated." "Negotiating with Nathan Calloway." Dante nodded, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "My father wants to handle this the old way, through strength and intimidation. I've been trying to convince him there's a better path, one that doesn't put more innocent people at risk." "Is he listening?" "Slowly," Dante said, a tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My father respects results more than methods, and so far, patience has yielded better results than aggression would have." Maya reached across the table, taking his hand gently. "Thank you for trying to keep things from escalating." "I would do far more than that to keep you safe," he said quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. But despite Dante's careful efforts toward diplomacy, the tension between the two families continued building beneath the surface, invisible to most of the city, but keenly felt by those close enough to the situation to understand its weight. Isabella, true to her earlier warning, had reached out several more times, always cautiously, always through indirect means, providing small pieces of information about Nathan Calloway's movements that she managed to gather from her remaining connections within his circle. It was through one of these indirect warnings that Maya learned about the gala. "There's a charity event next Friday," Isabella explained during a hurried phone call, her voice barely above a whisper as if worried about being overheard even from wherever she was calling. "Both families will be there. It's neutral ground, technically, but Nathan has been telling people he intends to make a statement that night. I don't know exactly what that means, but given everything else, I don't think it's good." Maya relayed the information to Dante immediately, watching his expression grow increasingly serious as she spoke. "The Hendricks Foundation Gala," he said slowly. "It's one of the few events where old families like ours are expected to maintain public civility, regardless of private conflicts. If Nathan intends to make a statement there, he's choosing a moment where he knows my hands will be somewhat tied by public expectation. Should we not go?" "Avoiding it would look like weakness," Dante said, "and weakness invites exactly the kind of aggression we're trying to prevent. No, we need to attend. But we need to be prepared for whatever he's planning." The days leading up to the gala passed in careful preparation. Dante's security team increased their presence around Maya significantly, and she found herself receiving quiet instructions about exit routes, safe rooms, and emergency contacts that made the entire situation feel disturbingly real in a way it hadn't quite felt before. She tried to focus on her bakery, on the familiar comfort of flour and sugar, but her mind kept drifting toward Friday night with a mixture of dread and determination. The night of the gala arrived with a cold, clear sky stretched over the city, stars barely visible through the persistent glow of streetlights below. Maya stood in front of her mirror, smoothing the deep green dress Dante had insisted on gifting her for the occasion, silk fabric flowing elegantly around her figure in a way that made her feel, for once, entirely confident rather than out of place. "You look beautiful," Grace said from the doorway, though worry still lingered clearly behind her supportive smile. "Please be careful tonight." "I will," Maya promised, though the words felt hollow given everything they both knew might be waiting for her. Dante arrived precisely on time, dressed in a sharp black suit that made him look every bit the powerful heir he was, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed the careful composure of his expression. He studied Maya for a long moment as she descended the stairs toward him, something warm and appreciative flickering across his features despite the weight of the evening ahead. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "As ready as I'll ever be," Maya replied, taking a steadying breath before stepping out into the cold night air beside him. The Hendricks Foundation Gala unfolded across the grand ballroom of one of the city's oldest hotels, chandeliers casting warm golden light across a sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits, string music floating gently over quiet conversation that carried an undercurrent of careful diplomacy Maya had grown increasingly familiar with over the past several months. She recognized several faces from the previous party, though this time, the whispers that followed her seemed less cruel and more curious, a shift she attributed entirely to Dante's public defense weeks earlier. They had barely settled near their assigned table when Dante's posture suddenly stiffened beside her, his eyes fixed on someone approaching from across the room. Maya followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Nathan Calloway moved through the crowd with unhurried confidence, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and sharp, calculating eyes that reminded Maya uncomfortably of a predator surveying its territory. Beside him walked a younger man Maya didn't recognize, broad-shouldered and watchful, clearly serving as some form of protection despite the supposedly neutral setting of the event. "Dante," Nathan said smoothly as he approached, extending a hand that Dante accepted with visible reluctance. "It's been too long." "Nathan," Dante replied evenly, his voice carefully controlled. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending this year." "I make it a point to support worthy causes," Nathan said, his gaze shifting deliberately toward Maya. "And who is this lovely woman? I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Maya Bennett," Dante said, his hand finding Maya's protectively. "My partner." Nathan's smile widened, something cold flickering beneath the polished exterior. "Ah, yes. I've heard quite a bit about you, Miss Bennett. A bakery owner, isn't that right? How refreshingly ordinary, given the circles you now find yourself moving within." "I like ordinary," Maya replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "It keeps me grounded." Something flickered in Nathan's expression, brief and unreadable, before he turned his attention back to Dante. I wonder if we might speak privately for a moment. Business matters, nothing that need concern the ladies present tonight. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Anything you need to discuss with me can be said in front of Maya. I don't keep secrets from her. How progressive, Nathan said, his smile never wavering despite the clear tension building beneath the surface of the conversation. Very well then. I've recently acquired several new business interests that overlap with territories your family has long considered exclusively theirs. I thought it only courteous to inform you directly, rather than allowing you to hear it through less reliable channels. Which territories? Dante asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the visible tension in his shoulders. The Eastern Docks, for one, Nathan said casually, as though discussing nothing more significant than weather patterns, and several properties along Ferrymore Street that your family has held for nearly 2 decades. I believe it's time for a redistribution of influence in this city, don't you agree? The implications hung heavy in the air between them, and Maya felt Dante's grip on her hand tighten slightly, though his expression remained carefully composed. Those territories were secured through legitimate business agreements. Nathan, I'm not interested in relitigating decisions made before either of us led our respective families. Times change, Nathan said with a shrug that felt deliberately provocative. Old agreements don't always hold the same weight they once did. Perhaps it's time your family considered a more equitable arrangement, one that reflects current realities rather than historical ones. And if I decline to consider such an arrangement? Nathan's smile finally faded, something colder and more dangerous replacing it. Then perhaps we'll need to explore other methods of persuasion. I understand you value certain things quite highly, Dante, family, territory, and of course, personal relationships. His gaze flicked deliberately toward Maya, the implication unmistakable and chilling. Is that a threat? Dante asked, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous that Maya had never heard from him before. Consider it a friendly reminder, Nathan said smoothly, that everyone has vulnerabilities and wise men protect theirs carefully. He offered a final, cold smile before turning away, his silent companion following closely behind him as they disappeared back into the crowd. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her hand trembling slightly in Dante's grip. That was a declaration, Dante finished grimly. He's not interested in negotiation. He's testing how far he can push before I retaliate. What happens now? Dante was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the crowd where Nathan had disappeared, calculating something Maya couldn't quite follow. Now, we finish this evening exactly as planned, calmly, and without giving him the satisfaction of seeing us rattled. And tomorrow, I make some calls that should have been made weeks ago. Despite the unsettling exchange, the rest of the evening passed without further incident, though Maya remained acutely aware of Nathan's presence across the room for the remainder of the night, his watchful eyes occasionally finding hers, even as he engaged in polite conversation with other guests. By the time they finally left the gala, exhaustion and lingering anxiety had settled heavily over Maya's shoulders, the elegant evening having transformed into something far more sinister than she had anticipated. He's not going to stop, is he? She asked quietly as Dante drove her home through empty midnight streets. No, Dante admitted, not without significant pressure applied in return. I've been trying to avoid full escalation, hoping cooler heads might prevail eventually. But after tonight, I don't think patience is going to be enough anymore. What does that mean exactly? Dante glanced at her, his expression tired but resolute. It means I need to speak with my father tomorrow, and together we need to decide how far we're willing to go to end this properly, before Nathan decides to act on the threat he made tonight. Maya stared out the window at the passing streetlights, fear and exhaustion mixing uncomfortably in her chest. "I never imagined my life would look like this," she admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Dante said, reaching over to take her hand gently. "I'm sorry, Maya, for all of it. For dragging you into a world you never asked to be part of." "I chose this," she reminded him softly. "I chose you, and I'm not going to regret that choice just because it's harder than I expected." Dante lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the same gesture he had made in front of 200 guests weeks earlier, though this time it felt quieter, more private, a promise renewed between just the two of them rather than declared to an audience. "Whatever happens next," he said, "I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Maya nodded, though uncertainty still lingered heavy in her chest. "I trust you." "Good," he said softly. "Because things are about to get considerably more complicated before they get better." Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive, the weight of Nathan Calloway's threat settling heavily between them, an unspoken understanding that the fragile peace they had been carefully maintaining was about to shatter completely, plunging them both into a conflict far larger and more dangerous than anything Maya could have imagined when she first walked into that ballroom weeks ago, humiliated by a jealous ex-girlfriend's cruel words. That humiliation now felt almost quaint compared to the danger gathering steadily around them, a storm that had been building for years, finally ready to break. The following morning, Dante sat across from his father in the older man's private office, a room lined with worn books and framed photographs spanning 3 generations of the Morty family. Vincent listened in silence as Dante recounted every detail of the previous night's confrontation, his weathered face giving little away until his son finished speaking. "Nathan is more reckless than his father ever was," Vincent said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Frank Calloway understood the value of patience. His son understands only the value of appearing strong, which is a far more dangerous flaw in a man holding real power." "What would you have me do?" Dante asked. Vincent studied him for a long moment before answering. "What do you want to do?" "I want to protect Maya without dragging this entire city into open conflict," Dante said. "I want to find a way to neutralize Nathan's threat without becoming the very thing you always warned me about. A man who solves every problem with force simply because force is available to him." A faint, approving smile crossed Vincent's face. "That is the correct answer, though it will be considerably harder to achieve than simply meeting strength with strength. Your grandfather used to say that the sharpest weapon in this business was never a gun. It was information, patience, and the willingness to let a man's own mistakes become the instrument of his downfall." "You think Nathan will make a mistake?" "I think men driven by wounded pride always do, eventually," Vincent said. "Your task is to be patient enough and prepared enough to recognize that mistake the moment it happens, and to act decisively when it does." Dante left his father's office with those words settling heavily in his mind, a framework beginning to take shape for how he might approach the coming days. He spent the following morning in quiet consultation with Lucas Hale, reviewing everything they had gathered about Nathan's operations, searching for the cracks that might eventually widen into the opportunity his father had described. Maya, meanwhile, tried to maintain some semblance of normal life despite the mounting tension surrounding her. She returned to the bakery each morning, though the presence of unfamiliar watchful men near her shop had become a constant, unsettling reminder that her world had irrevocably changed. Regular customers occasionally asked about the quiet strangers lingering nearby, and Maya found herself offering vague, unconvincing explanations that satisfied no one, least of all herself. It was during one such morning, as she arranged fresh pastries in the display case, that she noticed a new customer standing near the entrance, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with unease. He was young, perhaps in his late 20s, dressed casually, but with an alertness in his posture that reminded her uncomfortably of the men who had accompanied Nathan Calloway at the gala. "Can I help you?" she asked carefully, keeping the counter between them. The young man offered a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just admiring the shop," he said. "Mr. Calloway speaks of it often, says it's quite charming for what it is." Maya's blood ran cold. "I'm not sure what you mean." "No need to be alarmed," he said smoothly, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "Simply passing along a friendly observation. Enjoy your day, Miss Bennet." He turned and left without purchasing anything, disappearing into the busy street beyond, leaving Maya standing frozen behind her counter, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone to call Dante immediately. This new, direct approach, someone walking into her own shop to deliver a veiled threat in person, marked a clear escalation from the anonymous notes of weeks earlier, and Maya understood with growing dread that whatever careful patience Dante and his father were exercising, Nathan Calloway's patience was running out considerably faster. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Maya knew before she even answered it that something terrible had happened. "Maya," Dante's voice was tight, controlled in the way she had learned meant he was fighting to stay calm despite intense pressure. "I need you to listen very carefully and do exactly what I say." She sat up immediately, sleep vanishing in an instant. "What's wrong?" "One of my delivery trucks was ambushed tonight on Ferrymore Street," he said. "2 of my men were hurt, not seriously but hurt, and there was a message left at the scene." "What kind of message?" Dante was quiet for a moment before answering. "Your name, Maya, written where my men would be sure to see it. Nathan wants me to know exactly who he's willing to target next." Fear washed over Maya in a cold wave, her hands beginning to tremble around the phone. "What do we do?" "I'm sending a car for you and Grace right now," Dante said. "I need both of you somewhere more secure than your apartment for a few days, at least until we understand exactly what we're dealing with." Within 20 minutes, a black car pulled up outside Maya's building, and 2 of Dante's men escorted both sisters, still half-dressed and thoroughly frightened, into the vehicle without much explanation beyond urgent reassurances that everything would be fine. Maya held Grace's hand tightly during the drive, both women silent, the weight of fear too heavy for conversation. They arrived at a large, unfamiliar house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and carefully placed security that Maya hadn't fully appreciated the necessity of until this exact moment. Dante met them at the door, his exhaustion evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes, though his relief at seeing them safe was equally visible. "You're safe here," he said, pulling Maya into a tight embrace. "I promise you that." "What happened to your men?" Maya asked, pulling back slightly to study his face. "They'll recover," Dante said grimly. But this was a clear message. Nathan is done with subtlety. Vincent Morty, Dante's father, appeared in the hallway behind them, an imposing figure despite his graying hair and the weariness evident in his posture. He studied Maya for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, before finally speaking. "So you're the woman causing all this trouble," he said, though there was no genuine hostility in his tone, more weary observation than accusation. "I'm sorry," Maya said quietly. "I never meant to bring danger to your family." Vincent shook his head slowly. "Nathan Calloway would have found some excuse to escalate eventually, regardless of you. Old grudges like this one always find a reason to resurface. You simply happen to be the reason he chose this time." He paused, studying her more carefully. "My son speaks of you often. More warmly than I've heard him speak of anyone in years." Maya glanced at Dante, surprised by this admission, and saw a faint flush of embarrassment color his cheeks despite the tension of the moment. "I care about her very much," he said simply. "Then we protect her," Vincent said, his tone shifting into something more decisive. "Whatever it takes." Over the following 2 days, the house became a hub of quiet, intense activity, men coming and going at all hours, hushed conversations happening behind closed doors that Maya was rarely invited to join. She spent most of her time with Grace in a comfortable guest room, trying to distract herself with books and quiet conversation, while fear continued gnawing steadily at the edges of her composure. It was on the third night that everything finally came to a head. Maya was awoken by raised voices echoing from somewhere downstairs, urgent and tense in a way that immediately set her heart racing. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Grace, and crept toward the staircase, straining to hear the conversation happening below. "Can't keep hiding behind walls forever," Dante was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "Every day we wait, Nathan grows more confident. We need to end this directly." "And what exactly do you propose?" Vincent's voice, gruffer, more measured, walking into his territory and demanding a resolution. That's exactly the kind of impulsive action that starts wars we can't win cleanly. "I'm not talking about violence," Dante said. "I'm talking about exposure. Isabella mentioned Nathan's been building alliances outside our usual circles, alliances that wouldn't survive public scrutiny. If we can expose those connections, we remove his leverage without a single shot fired." Maya crept closer to the staircase, listening intently as the conversation continued. "You're suggesting we go to the authorities?" Vincent's voice carried clear skepticism. "Not directly," Dante clarified. "But there are journalists, business partners, political connections that would drop Nathan instantly if certain information became public. He's been laundering resources through several legitimate businesses that wouldn't survive that kind of attention." "And how exactly do you plan to acquire this information?" There was a pause before Dante answered. "Isabella has access to records from her time working alongside Nathan's associates. She's willing to provide them, in exchange for certain guarantees regarding her own safety once this is resolved." Maya's breath caught. Isabella was helping directly now, not just through cautious warnings but active involvement in bringing down Nathan Calloway. "You trust her?" Vincent asked skeptically. "I trust that she's more afraid of Nathan than she is loyal to any lingering resentment toward Maya," Dante replied. "That's enough for now." The conversation continued for several more minutes, details of a plan slowly taking shape that Maya could only partially follow from her position on the staircase. Eventually, footsteps approached, and she quickly retreated back toward the guest room, her mind racing with everything she had just overheard. The next morning, Dante found her in the kitchen, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. "You look like you didn't sleep either," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "I heard you and your father talking last night," Maya admitted. "About Isabella, about exposing Nathan's connections." Dante's expression flickered with mild surprise, before settling into something more resigned. "I suppose it was inevitable you'd find out eventually." "Is it dangerous, what you're planning?" "Everything about this situation is dangerous," he admitted. "But exposure is safer than direct confrontation. If we can strip away Nathan's protection, his alliances, his carefully built reputation, he becomes far less capable of following through on threats like the one made to my men. And Isabella is helping with this." Dante nodded slowly. "She reached out again last night after the attack on my delivery truck. She's frightened, Maya. Frightened enough to finally choose the right side of this conflict, regardless of her earlier resentment toward you." Maya sat quietly for a moment, processing this information. "I never thought I'd feel grateful toward the woman who humiliated me in front of 200 people." "Desperation changes people's priorities quickly," Dante said. "For what it's worth, I think she genuinely regrets how far this situation has spiraled beyond her initial jealousy." Over the following days, a careful plan began taking shape. pieces slowly falling into place through quiet meetings and careful information gathering that Maya was only occasionally allowed to witness firsthand. Isabella provided detailed records of Nathan's financial connections, revealing a complex web of illegal transactions disguised behind several seemingly legitimate businesses scattered throughout the city. Dante's men worked quickly and quietly to verify this information, building a case strong enough to withstand the scrutiny that would follow its eventual exposure. It was nearly a week later when Dante finally gathered Maya, Grace, Vincent, and several trusted associates in the house's main study, spreading documents across a large wooden table with careful precision. "We're ready," he announced, his voice carrying quiet confidence despite the exhaustion still visible beneath his composed exterior. "Tomorrow, this information reaches 3 separate journalists, along with several business partners who have unknowingly been associated with Nathan's illegal operations. By the end of the week, his carefully built reputation should collapse entirely." "And if he retaliates before that happens?" Maya asked, worry still evident in her voice. "We've increased security significantly," Dante assured her. "And more importantly, Nathan doesn't yet know we possess this information. Surprise remains our strongest advantage." The next 24 hours passed in tense anticipation, Maya finding it nearly impossible to focus on anything beyond the knowledge that their careful plan was finally being set into motion. She paced restlessly through the house, unable to eat properly, unable to sleep, waiting anxiously for news of how Nathan would respond once the information reached its intended targets. The news broke late the following evening, spreading quickly through local business circles before eventually reaching wider media attention. Nathan Calloway's carefully constructed empire began crumbling rapidly under the weight of exposed financial crimes, illegal territorial expansions, and connections to several undisclosed criminal enterprises that had, until now, remained hidden beneath a veneer of legitimate business success. Maya watched the news coverage alongside Dante and his family, a strange mixture of relief and lingering anxiety settling over the room as reporters detailed allegation after allegation against a man who had, just days earlier, threatened her safety directly. "Is it over?" she asked quietly, watching Dante's carefully guarded expression as another news segment played across the television screen. "Not entirely," he admitted. "Cornered men often become more dangerous before they finally surrender. We need to remain cautious for a while longer." His words proved prophetic almost immediately. Later that same night, as the house began settling into a rare moment of cautious relief, an urgent call came through, shattering the fragile peace that had briefly settled over the household. Nathan Calloway, furious and desperate following the sudden collapse of his carefully built empire, had been spotted near the outskirts of the property, accompanied by several armed associates, clearly intent on confronting Dante directly before authorities could act on the newly exposed evidence against him. The final confrontation, Maya realized with a cold, sinking feeling in her stomach, was no longer a distant possibility. It was happening now tonight, and there was no telling exactly how it would end. Grace gripped Maya's hand tightly as the two sisters sat together in the dimly lit sitting room, the news broadcast still playing quietly on the television, though neither of them was truly watching it anymore. "Do you think he's really coming here?" Grace whispered. "I don't know," Maya admitted, her voice barely steady. "But Dante's men have been preparing for this possibility for days. He said the property is secure." "Nothing about tonight feels secure," Grace said, and Maya couldn't bring herself to disagree. Isabella called just minutes later, her voice tight with urgency when Maya answered. "I heard Nathan is heading toward the Morty estate. I wanted to warn you, though I suspect you already know." "We know," Maya said. "Isabella, thank you for everything you've done these past weeks. I don't think I said that clearly enough before now. Just make sure Dante stays safe." Isabella replied, her voice cracking slightly with an emotion Maya hadn't expected to hear from her. Whatever happened between us, whatever I did out of jealousy, I never wanted any of this. I never wanted anyone hurt. I believe you, Maya said softly, and she found, surprisingly, that she truly did. The call ended, and Maya sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the strange journey that had brought her and Isabella from bitter enemies to something resembling cautious allies, both women shaped and humbled by the same dangerous storm that had swept unexpectedly into both their lives. Meanwhile, in the estate's main study, Vincent Morty stood at the window studying the darkened grounds beyond, his expression calm despite the tension radiating through the house. He had faced moments like this before, decades earlier, when his own leadership of the family had been tested by men just as desperate and reckless as Nathan Calloway now appeared to be. Experience had taught him that desperation, while dangerous, was also predictable in its own way, and predictability could be managed with proper preparation. "Positions are set," Lucas Hale reported quietly, appearing in the doorway. "Every entrance is covered. If Nathan intends to force his way onto this property, he'll find considerably more resistance than he anticipated." "Good," Vincent said, turning from the window. "Where is my son?" "Preparing to meet Nathan directly at the front entrance," Lucas said. "He believes a controlled confrontation is safer than allowing Nathan to feel cornered enough to act unpredictably from a distance." Vincent nodded slowly, a flicker of paternal pride crossing his weathered features despite the gravity of the situation. "He's learned patience after all." "Good. Make sure nothing happens to him tonight, Lucas. I mean that." "I always do," Lucas said simply, before disappearing back toward the front of the house to oversee the final preparations before Nathan's arrival. Downstairs in the safe room, Maya pressed her ear gently against the reinforced door, straining to hear anything beyond the muffled silence surrounding them, her heart pounding with a fear that felt entirely different from the humiliation of that first cruel evening months ago. That fear had been about pride, about belonging, about whether she measured up to some invisible standard set by a world she barely understood. This fear was raw and immediate, rooted in the simple, desperate hope that everyone she loved would still be standing when this long, dangerous night finally came to an end. Dante moved through the house with sharp, decisive urgency, giving quiet instructions to his men while Vincent stood near the window, watching the darkened property beyond with narrowed, calculating eyes. "Take the women to the safe room downstairs," Vincent ordered firmly. "Now." "Dad, I need to." "You need to let your men handle the perimeter while you make sure Maya and Grace are secure," Vincent interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This is not the moment for heroics, Dante. This is the moment for discipline." Dante hesitated only briefly before nodding, turning to guide Maya and Grace toward a hidden staircase behind the study's bookshelf, leading down into a reinforced room clearly built for exactly this kind of emergency. Maya's heart pounded painfully against her ribs as they descended, fear tightening every muscle in her body. "Dante, please be careful," she said, gripping his arm tightly once they reached the bottom of the stairs. "I will be," he promised, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I need you to stay here no matter what you hear. Can you promise me that?" Maya nodded, though tears were already gathering in her eyes. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise," he said firmly, before pressing a swift kiss to her forehead and disappearing back up the staircase, leaving Maya and Grace alone in the tense silence of the safe room. The minutes that followed felt like hours, muffled sounds occasionally reaching them from above, footsteps, distant voices, though nothing clear enough to understand exactly what was happening. Grace held Maya's hand tightly, both women sitting pressed against the cold wall, straining to hear any indication of how the confrontation above was unfolding. Upstairs, Dante stood beside his father in the entrance hall as Nathan Calloway strode through the front door, flanked by two associates whose expressions carried the desperate recklessness of men with nothing left to lose. Nathan's usually composed exterior had cracked entirely, revealing raw fury beneath the surface as he faced Dante directly. "You destroyed everything I built," Nathan snarled, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Years of careful work, gone in a single week, because of that woman you insisted on parading around publicly." "You destroyed it yourself," Dante replied evenly, refusing to let Nathan's anger provoke a matching reaction. "Every illegal transaction, every hidden alliance, those were your choices, Nathan. I simply made sure the consequences finally caught up with you." "I should have taken care of her weeks ago," Nathan spat. "Before any of this escalated." Something cold and dangerous flickered across Dante's expression at the implied threat toward Maya, though his voice remained steady when he responded. "But you didn't. And now you're standing in my father's house, outnumbered, exposed, with authorities already investigating every corner of your remaining operations. What exactly did you think coming here tonight would accomplish?" Nathan's composure cracked further, desperation clear in his wild eyes. "I wanted you to understand what it feels like to lose everything you've built." "I understand perfectly," Dante said quietly. "I understand that desperate men make foolish choices, Nathan. Choices that end conversations like this one very differently than they intend." Vincent stepped forward then, his presence commanding despite his age, addressing Nathan with the authority of decades spent navigating exactly these kinds of dangerous confrontations. "Nathan, you have two options remaining. Leave this property immediately and face whatever consequences your own choices have brought upon you through legitimate channels, or continue this confrontation and discover exactly how heavily outnumbered you currently are." Nathan glanced toward his two remaining associates, both men shifting nervously, clearly aware that Dante's own security significantly outnumbered their small group. Whatever reckless plan Nathan had envisioned for this confrontation was crumbling rapidly under the weight of simple, practical reality. "This isn't finished," Nathan finally said, though the threat carried far less weight than it had moments earlier, desperation replacing genuine menace in his tone. "Yes," Dante said firmly, "it is." For a long, tense moment nobody moved, the air thick with unresolved tension. Then, finally, Nathan's shoulders slumped slightly, defeat settling visibly over his features as he realized the confrontation he had envisioned was not going to unfold the way he had hoped. Without another word, he turned and left, his associates following closely behind, disappearing back into the darkness beyond the property's carefully maintained walls. Only once the sound of departing vehicles faded completely into the distance did Dante finally allow himself to exhale, tension slowly draining from his shoulders as the immediate danger passed. He turned to his father, gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you," he said quietly. Vincent nodded, though his expression remained serious. "This isn't fully finished, son. Nathan may have retreated tonight, but a man that desperate rarely disappears quietly. We'll need to remain vigilant." "I know," Dante agreed, "but tonight at least everyone is safe." He hurried back down to the safe room, finding Maya and Grace still huddled together, fear evident on both their faces. The moment Maya saw him, relief washed over her so powerfully that her legs nearly gave out beneath her. "You're safe," she breathed, rushing into his arms. "We're all safe," he confirmed, holding her tightly against his chest. "It's over, Maya, at least for tonight." Over the following weeks, the situation continued unfolding largely in Dante's favor. Authorities, following the trail of evidence provided through the earlier exposure, moved steadily against Nathan Calloway's remaining operations, dismantling what little influence he had managed to preserve following that tense final confrontation. Isabella, true to the quiet redemption she had been working toward, provided additional testimony that further solidified the case against him, her cooperation eventually earning her a measure of protection from the legal consequences of her own earlier involvement. Maya visited Isabella once, several weeks after the confrontation, finding her in a small, unfamiliar apartment far removed from the glamorous world she had once inhabited so confidently. "I wanted to thank you," Maya said, standing somewhat awkwardly in the doorway, "for everything you did eventually. I know it wasn't easy." Isabella offered a tired, genuine smile, so different from the cold confidence Maya remembered from that first fateful party. "I owed you that much, at least. I'm sorry, Maya, for all of it. The party, the notes, everything I set in motion out of jealousy and wounded pride." "I forgive you," Maya said softly, surprising herself with how genuinely she meant those words. "You're kinder than I deserve," Isabella replied. "Maybe," Maya said with a small smile. "Or maybe everyone deserves a chance to become someone better than their worst moment." As the immediate danger from Nathan Calloway finally faded into resolved history, life slowly began settling back into something resembling normalcy for Maya and Dante. The bakery reopened fully, customers returning to their familiar routines, unaware of exactly how close disaster had come to touching their quiet corner of the city. Grace eventually moved back into her own apartment, though she visited frequently. The bond between the sisters strengthened rather than strained by everything they had endured together. Dante, meanwhile, began stepping more fully into leadership within his family's business, guided by lessons learned through the recent crisis toward a more careful, less impulsively aggressive approach to managing old rivalries and building new alliances. Vincent, watching his son navigate these challenges with growing confidence and wisdom, found himself increasingly proud of the man Dante was becoming, shaped as much by Maya's steady influence as by his own careful upbringing. It was nearly 3 months after that tense final confrontation when Dante finally invited Maya back to the same grand ballroom where everything had first begun, another charity gala hosted by the same foundation, though this time the invitation carried an unspoken significance that made Maya's heart race with anticipation rather than dread. She dressed carefully that evening, choosing a deep blue gown that made her feel confident and beautiful, remembering with quiet pride exactly how far she had traveled since that first humiliating night months earlier. When Dante arrived to collect her, his expression carried something different than she had seen before, nervous anticipation mixed with unmistakable love. "You look stunning," he said softly, taking her hand. "You seem nervous," Maya observed, studying his face carefully. "Perhaps a little," he admitted with a small smile. The ballroom, when they arrived, looked much as it had months earlier, elegant and glittering beneath warm golden chandeliers, familiar faces from that first tense evening scattered throughout the crowd. But this time, Maya moved through the space with genuine confidence, greeted warmly by people who had watched her journey unfold over these past difficult months with evident respect and admiration. Midway through the evening, Dante guided her gently toward the same window where they had once stood together following Isabella's cruel humiliation, the city lights stretching endlessly below just as they had that first tense night. "Do you remember standing here?" he asked quietly. "I remember everything about that night," Maya replied, "the good and the difficult parts both." "I've thought about this moment for weeks," Dante said, his voice carrying a vulnerability Maya had rarely heard from him. "About the right words, the right way to ask you something I've known for certain since long before Isabella ever said a cruel word to you." Maya's breath caught as Dante slowly lowered himself onto one knee, producing a small velvet box from his jacket pocket with hands that trembled slightly despite his usually composed demeanor. "Maya Bennett," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "You walked into my life and taught me what it truly means to be chosen for exactly who I am, rather than for what I possess or represent. You face threats, danger, and cruelty with more courage than I've witnessed in men who spent their entire lives training for exactly these kinds of challenges. You never once asked me to become someone different, and in return, you helped me become someone better. Tears streamed freely down Maya's cheeks as the surrounding guests fell into a hushed, attentive silence, watching the scene unfold with evident emotion. I love you, Dante continued, completely, without hesitation, and without any concern for what anyone else in this room or any room might think about where I choose to find happiness. Will you marry me? Maya, overwhelmed with emotion, could barely manage a single word through her tears. Yes, she finally whispered, then louder. Yes, absolutely yes. The ballroom erupted into warm applause as Dante rose and swept Maya into his arms, spinning her gently as relief, and joy replaced months of accumulated fear and tension. Grace, watching from nearby with tears streaming down her own face, rushed forward to embrace her sister the moment Dante finally set her back down. I'm so happy for you, Grace whispered. I'm happy for both of us, Maya replied, glancing toward the crowd of familiar faces who had witnessed both her lowest moment and now, finally, her greatest joy within these same elegant walls. Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Maya found herself once again standing near the same window overlooking the city, though this time she wore a ring that caught the light beautifully whenever she moved her hand, a permanent reminder of exactly how far she had traveled since that first painful night months earlier. Isabella's cruel words felt impossibly distant now, a memory belonging to a different version of herself, one who had not yet understood her own worth or the strength she carried within her. Maya realized, watching Dante move confidently through the crowd, laughing warmly with old friends and newly formed allies alike, that everything difficult they had endured together had only strengthened the foundation of what they were building. She thought about the bakery waiting patiently for her return each morning, about the small apartment she had once considered entirely too modest for Dante's polished world, about every insecurity that had once made her feel like an imposter, standing beside a man whose life seemed impossibly distant from her own quiet routines. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was standing here, in this same ballroom where she had once been humiliated and doubted, now celebrated and chosen, surrounded by people who had witnessed her transformation from uncertain outsider into someone respected, someone valued, someone who belonged exactly where she stood. Dante found her again near the window, wrapping his arms gently around her waist from behind, resting his chin softly against her shoulder as they both gazed out at the glittering city lights stretching endlessly into the night. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Maya turned in his arms, studying his face with quiet certainty. Not a single one. Every difficult moment led us exactly here, and I wouldn't trade this feeling for an easier path. Neither would I, Dante agreed, pressing a gentle kiss against her lips as the city continued its endless glow beneath them, indifferent to the quiet, powerful love story that had unfolded within one of its many glittering rooms. Months later, their wedding would take place in a quiet countryside ceremony far removed from the glamorous chaos of that eventful year, surrounded only by family and closest friends, including, surprisingly, a humbled and grateful Isabella, whose own path toward redemption had continued steadily forward since that final confrontation with Nathan Calloway. Maya stood at the head of the celebration table that day, no longer the uncertain woman mocked for not fitting into an unfamiliar world, but a confident bride surrounded by genuine love and hard-earned respect. She had learned, through danger and difficulty far greater than cruel words at a single party, that true belonging was never about matching someone else's expectations or fitting into predetermined molds of status and appearance. It was about being chosen, completely and without hesitation, for exactly who she had always been. And as Dante raised his glass that evening, toasting the woman who had transformed his understanding of love, loyalty, and genuine partnership. Maya finally understood, fully and completely, that every difficult step of their journey had led them precisely where they were always meant to be. In the years that followed, Maya's bakery grew into something of a local landmark, a warm, unpretentious corner of the city where people from every walk of life gathered over fresh bread and honest conversation. She never changed the shop to fit Dante's world. Instead, without either of them quite planning it, his world slowly learned to fit around hers, powerful men in tailored suits standing patiently in line beside schoolteachers and delivery drivers, all drawn by the same simple, reliable warmth Maya had always offered so freely. Vincent visited every Sunday morning without fail, always ordering the same cinnamon loaf, always staying long enough to talk with Maya about small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with territories or alliances. He had grown fond of her in a way he rarely admitted aloud, though everyone who watched them together understood exactly how much respect had grown between them. Grace eventually met someone of her own, a quiet, steady man entirely unconnected to the dangerous world that had once threatened to consume her sister's life, and Maya found deep comfort in watching Grace build a life defined by simplicity and safety, everything Maya herself had once taken for granted before that first fateful party. And on quiet evenings, when the bakery had closed and the city outside had settled into its familiar evening hum, Maya would sometimes think back to that humiliating moment by the dessert table, to the sound of shattering glass and cruel laughter, to the terrifying uncertainty that had followed in the months after. It no longer felt like the defining moment of her story. It felt instead like the beginning, the first difficult step of a journey that had ultimately led her exactly where she was always meant to be, standing beside a man who had chosen her completely, in a life built not on status or appearance, but on something far sturdier and far more lasting. Together, chosen, and finally, entirely at peace.